I just got the new RoyalTS 5.0 update, and I noticed within it, it has a new feature called Dynamic Folders and Dynamic Credentials. Taking a look into this real quick, I noticed that it uses a bunch of popular script interpreters to be able to create these dynamic folders. The one that caught my attention right away was PowerShell. I live 90% of my life inside of PowerShell, and I wanted to take advantage of this immediately to be able to list all of the servers at work. So I spun up a test domain at home, and I have that AD structure now in place. So if we take a look at my AD, I have this empty OU called test OU. I have a bunch of other OUs that are multiple levels deep, and they have computers in them at various points. So what my goal is to get a dynamic folder which recreates this structure entirely if there's a computer under that OU. So I shouldn't see test OU in there. With it logging in with this Mike S credential each time. Now, if you're not familiar with this, what you can do is on royalapplications.com, if you go to their support site and look under their knowledge base for Royal JSON and dynamic folders, they have a documentation link to it's a PDF file with documentation on this Royal JSON, as well as some samples and what they're calling their toolbox repository over on GitHub, which is beautiful. So if I pull up this PDF here, notice all these properties are available for use and definition within the object. So if you're like, what do I need to enter in for something? So let's say credential name. I can click on that and see how that my JSON should be formatted, but I can also see how I can call, let's say, credential name here for administrator. So they have examples for all this. So take good use of that. So again, my world, I live 90% of the time in PowerShell. So I just whipped together a quick script. What I want to do is I want to get all my computers under a certain OU. In this case, that OU is enterprise servers. And I'm getting all of them. And I'm searching the subtree, and I'm getting the canonical name property. The reason I'm getting canonical name is I can use that to automatically build a folder structure inside of RoyalTS without having to build the structure manually first. I let RoyalTS handle that for me. I'm using a system collections array list instead of a standard array. And the reason I'm doing that is primarily for performance. On small things like this, you're not going to see that big of a hit on performance. When you're dealing with maybe a few thousand objects, you're going to see a much larger performance hit. The reason being arrays, just straight standard arrays, it has to recopy the array to a new object and then add the new object every time you do add a new object in. Array list is dynamic. So what I'm doing basically is for each computer I'm getting back from in my for each loop here, I'm adding to that array a new object, and this new object is going to form the basis for this JSON object. So let me pull this in here, and I'm just going to go to my PowerShell here. And notice it really quickly created a JSON document here and output it to the screen. If I look at my array only, notice it's an array of objects, exactly as we defined it. And if you're used to PowerShell, how you're used to creating objects. One thing I'm doing here is I'm sorting it by path. I'm sorting it alphabetically by path. The reason is I want to, again, mimic how this looks. If you don't sort it by path, it just comes up unsorted on your screen. It's up to you if you want that or not. I just find that it helps if it mimics AD exactly. And then I'm creating the hash table so that way the JSON object is the way that they're expecting it. And so the way that this hash table has to look it has to have a key of objects. And underneath value can be your array of objects. So this is how your hash table has to be defined, at least in PowerShell, for it to work correctly as a JSON object. I haven't investigated or used the other ones, PHP, Ruby, and that, but RoyalTS within the application itself does give you examples of hard-coded examples. So if you were to go into RoyalTS and go to new dynamic folder and then choose your interpreter, let's say I want to do this in Perl. Notice it's giving me an example in Perl of how to create my my object, manually. I can then take this and translate this back into some functions so that way I get that same output in Perl. Now, one thing I did notice, and I will need to ask RoyalTS on this. If you look at their PowerShell example, they're using write host to write this out to their processor. You do not need to do that. You can just let it write the object out to the stream as normal. So I will have to ask them on that. But if I take my code in here and I create a new dynamic folder. And go to dynamic folder script, PowerShell, and set my script in there. Notice by default, you don't get anything in there. You actually have to right click and choose reload. When you do that, query is going to run. And now if we look, this is the same structure that I have in Active Directory. Notice that test.ou is not inside of my example folder here. And that's because there's no computer in it. And that's only because of how my script was written. Now notice I'm doing get AD computer. If I would have done instead get AD organizational unit to create the structure first, then I could have the folder show up even if it's empty. Instead, like I said, I'm relying on RoyalTS to create that pathing for me automatically. And it's doing that based on that canonical name. Now notice in here, I'm just taking the full canonical name, just minus the computer name. So that way it's still, it starts off at my root of my domain name. If you wanted to, you could have it start off at enterprise servers. You don't have to have it start off up here. You would just have to modify what comes out under path here. So I would add another replace company.pri with blanks. So that's adding a dynamic folder to RoyalTS. It's pretty simple, pretty powerful too. One quick addendum to this I wanted to add here. In RoyalTS, you are not able to add connections under what's called this application folder. So under application here, I have a dynamic folder, the default one, the hard-coded PowerShell one. So if we look at this here, so notice it's going to create a credential object, a folder, and a connection. Currently, RoyalTS does not give you any indication that you cannot have a connection under there when creating it through a dynamic folder. So if I'm looking at this, I'm like, well, why is my connection not there? I think something may be wrong. But if you were to go in here and try to choose remote desktop, for example, you cannot add connections to the applications document. Must be stored in separate document. And notice if you have another document open, it'll try to automatically choose that other document for you to store it in. So if you try to create your dynamic folder underneath the application document, you will not see any of your connections. Just go ahead and create a new document and put them under there. All right, thanks. Hopefully you found this helpful. If so, please let me know. If not, please let me know what I could have done different to make this maybe a little bit more useful for you. Have a good one.